All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. It has been way more weeks than it was supposed to be because of challenging internet issues and whatnot. But we are finally back. This is Words number 36.3, and this is the third attempt at recording this show. So hopefully the third time is a charm. Danny Katz and Robert Forte are with me. And today we are going to, this one's probably going to be, depending on the style of show you like, this might be the most interesting one for people or the most obnoxious. Either way, it could go either way. But today we are going to talk about Timothy Leary, and Robert Forte, of course, knew Timothy Leary, as he knows all of the people we talk about in these series. And Danny and I only know Timothy Leary through things we've heard, things we've read, psychic channelings, and other remote viewing types of technologies and whatnot. And so I think the way this is going to go is probably an antithesis, a thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of process. And so I guess we're gonna kind of do it in a more orderly fashion than we normally do to accommodate what I think is going to happen here. So welcome to both of you, first of all. Welcome back. It's nice to see you guys.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
And I think we will, let's start with the thesis. And for that, we will go to the great historian and scholar and writer himself, Robert Forte, to tell us about his good friend, Timothy Leary.
Okay, well, let's see. We're just going to jump right in. I've tried my best not to think too much about this, so we could be more spontaneous here. And it's kind of ironic that you would like to frame this podcast in a more orderly way, because Tim's life and Tim's role in psychedelic history in particular was anything but orderly. And he was really, as you said, I knew him like I knew the other people that we were talking about, but really I knew Tim much better, much more intimately, and had a lot more contact with him over a longer period of time. I not only knew him by a personal connection, but I knew him very well because his best friend, Frank Barron, who I think I've mentioned a couple times, we could do a whole show on him. Frank Barron was Timothy's best friend, and he was one of my most important teachers. And he's a not well-known character in the modern psychedelic movement, but he is one of the most significant. We all know about the Harvard project. Many people think that that was a project that Timothy Leary did with Richard Alpert, who turned into Ram Dass. And that's partly true, but it was actually Frank Barron who started that project at Harvard and who turned Tim on. Frank was also one of the most respected personality psychologists and expert in the psychology of creativity. And he's really the guy who started the psychedelic movement that Tim became most known for. And Tim is also the most misunderstood character in the modern psychedelic movement. And in my frame of reference, my favorite character, one of the most lovable and intelligent and important people who have played in this field of psychedelia. And I feel it's kind of a responsibility of mine to really come out more with his story that's been eclipsed by a lot of the sensationalism that he generated, by a lot of the CIA shenanigans of which he was a major part. He was a very inconsistent character. He's a flawed hero, but he's, as I said, one of the most important and interesting characters. And it's really going to take a little time to sort out who he was and what he did. One of his great lines near the end of his life was, "You get the Timothy Leary you deserve." And he was, there are so many aspects to his life, so many different characters that he played in this history of psychedelics that, really started in the late 1950s with him and went on through, kind of the mid 1970s. And that was really the peak of his psychedelic history. Only one aspect of his life. So I was, like a lot of people who get interested in psychedelics as a scholarship, as a scholar, first, kind of put off by him, that his, we all know the kind of common narrative. You see it repeated a lot, and especially in Michael Pollan's 2018 book, that psychedelics were kind of coming along in society. They were noticed by psychiatrists. There was a lot of research to show that they were valuable for therapy, for neuroscience, and lots of projects all over the world. And then Timothy Leary started this thing, and Timothy Leary got so outrageous that the government had to make these drugs illegal and demand that researchers all around the country return their supplies. And Timothy Leary is often blamed for the cessation of research, that the cessation began kind of in the mid 1960s, where there were hundreds of studies, and there weren't really any studies again until fairly recently. You see Rick Doblin often repeating this thing, like, we have to bury the ghost of Timothy Leary. He blew it for all of us, good-hearted scientists that wanted to explore the rich potential of these psychedelic drugs. And so I was, and that was sort of Frank Barron's position. And that's kind of what I thought when I was a young scholar in my early 20s, deciding to take an interest in these things and wanting to make a career out of them as a researcher. And I was told, like, oh no, Tim Leary, he blew it for everybody. You can't, it's very difficult to get permission to do this. And so he was kind of an enemy of mine. And the first couple times I met him, first time I met him was in 1981. No, actually, the first time I met him was 1979, but just very briefly. He gave a talk at what was called the Community Consciousness Carnival here in Northern California. And I met this guy. He'd only been out of prison for a couple of years. He was dancing and prancing around the stage. He seemed very distracted and kind of burned out and straining for laughs. And really, I have to say, I'm sorry, Tim, you seem like kind of a pitiful character to me. You just seem like a classic burned out, acid head who, an egomaniac, just craving attention. And then I met him again in 1981, when I organized a conference at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and he and Stan Groff were the two keynote speakers. And I introduced him to a crowd of 300 or 400 people, and I chauffeured him around, and we kind of hung out a little bit. And I noticed that there was something uniquely brilliant and uniquely spirited about this guy. First of all, his sense of humor and the quickness of his mind and his presence. When he paid attention to you, he paid attention to you in a way that I felt with no other human being. He could really listen. He could really feed back what you said. And I began to get a sense of a kind of greatness about this man. But still, he was, whenever you mentioned his name to any of the other former researchers or would-be researchers, Timothy Leary, they'd go, oh, he blew it. We could have been so much farther along here if it wasn't for him. And and I felt that way. And I was plodding along in my various ways, trying to get scholars and religion and scientists to come together. I organized all these conferences at different places. I've mentioned this, I think, before in earlier podcasts, at the best universities, at Harvard, at UCLA, Santa Cruz, University of Chicago, trying to get conversations going. And Tim was kind of our enemy. In fact, when I first started on this project and I went to see him, and the first thing he said to me was, Robert, I heard everything that you're doing, and I just have one thing to say to you, and that is, fuck the government. Don't bother trying to get their permission. Just do what you want to do. Fuck the government. I just love that line. And that was kind of classic Leary antagonism and what he was known and what he was loathed for. And so I continued on my way. And after a few years, rather frustrating to deal with government institutions and a lot of factors. And I began to realize that when I had this experience with Albert Hofmann in Switzerland that I mentioned, you know, when I began to realize that Albert had some unresolved and kind of vile anti-Semitic feelings. And then I traced that back to some of his kind of proximity to notorious figures in the Third Reich. And I began to, you know, this whole psychedelic story took on another dimension. And there was a footnote in Timothy's autobiography, Flashbacks, about a relationship that Albert Hofmann had with Ernst Jünger, a uber right-wing literary figure who was a close friend of Albert Hofmann's. And so after returning from this trip to Switzerland, I wanted to go down and visit Tim and talk about this. And it was the first time in my life that I had, he said, oh, come on down. His wife was away. It was just Tim and I alone in his house in Beverly Hills for the weekend. And there I met a guy that was just really gave me the time, and we began to talk. And I began to realize that he was an unsung hero. And people didn't even quite realize why he was such a hero. And it was at that point that I decided that I was going to kind of quit my efforts to legitimize psychedelics within the institutions and really congratulate Tim for his role in democratizing them and in popularizing them. And that's when I decided, that was the weekend I decided to begin to do this book about him, a Festschrift. A Festschrift is an academic custom, a festival of writing, statements by his contemporaries about a great scholar or artist's legacy. Because I knew, I could see then, this was back in 1993, that there was going to be a psychedelic renaissance, that the CIA was going to try again with their Mkultra operation, and that Tim was going to be reamed in the press. They were going to exploit this narrative that I just said, that he blew it for everyone, that he was an egomaniac, and that he was reckless, and some of these things are true. But I wanted to introduce into the literature another point of view about this guy. Now, I deliberately left out a lot of the CIA stuff because, again, this book was really mostly an honor to Tim. It was given to him on his 75th birthday, and he didn't like the subject of conspiracies or conspiracy theory. I believe he had taken a vow not to really divulge his relationship with the CIA. He was kind of embarrassed about it. He had conflicted feelings about it. And so I just didn't put that into this book at all. But as I kind of dropped out of the subject of psychedelics for a few years, but now that I've returned, I think that this subject of the CIA's role in popularizing psychedelic drugs really needs to get flushed out. And Leary is a really central character there. So maybe I'll just stop there for a minute and hear what some of you got. Let's dialogue here a little bit. Trilogue.
Great. I think that's a great place to take a pause. A couple things popped to mind. One was you mentioned that he was notably rich in spirit, and I think I'm obviously paraphrasing, but I mean, Emily, you and I both grew up in LA. I don't see how anyone rich in spirit would live in Beverly Hills. I can't think of a less spiritual, like it's nowhere. Like that's so weird to me that anyone lives there, let alone someone who's allegedly like really tapped in and operating on a lot of levels. And I also thought that when I read John Perry Barlow's bit in your book, where I thought, okay, we have John Perry Barlow, who was working for the CIA for 30 years, talking about his friend who was also a CIA guy, and his story of choice is this like kind of misogynistic romp about womanizing with his buddy in Beverly Hills. So I just thought that it just felt like this sheen of Hollywood kind of glossed over it. And I did notice that you did skip over Tim's CIA, which is to me like so pertinent to the whole conversation, but you did say his girlfriend narc, Joanne Harcourt Smith, and it seemed like you spent a little bit more time talking about how she was the sellout and she was the rat, and kind of like nudging that over to her.
Okay, well, like I said at the beginning, there are, this is going to take a while to kind of parse this out, because I mean, I personally agree with you about the, what do we say, the soullessness of the Hollywood and LA kind of scene. But Tim, I meant rich in spirit, not in a sense of spirit and soulfulness, although he was very deeply imbued with that. I just meant more like just his animated character and his joy of life.
He had charisma.
Yeah, he had charisma, he had brilliance, and he was not consistent. He was not consistent at all. He kind of played the moment. And so, and he also felt destined, since he was a young child, but I found these remarkable letters. They were given to me by Rosemary about what he wrote when he was at West Point, about his destiny, and that he wanted to be famous. He just felt like he was destined for fame. And so LA was the spotlight of the world. And if he wanted to broadcast his message, that was going to be a place where he could do it from.
Yeah.
So, and let me just add in here that often in these conversations, I feel like I get into a position where I want to defend him, because I really loved him. And so I am going to defend him, but I'm not oblivious to these inconsistencies and in his character. That's why he makes such an important character. I'm working on a screenplay about him. He's such a mercurial guy. And all of these things can be true at once. In fact, one of the reasons that I decided to do the book like this about him, I think I might have mentioned it in here, is that it's not really possible to take a picture of Tim. You have to take a lot of pictures of him, and you have to look at them all from different angles. And so we have to be, in fact, this was his contribution to psychology, to personality assessment, before his psychedelic stuff. This is what made him unique and got him his appointment to Harvard, that he developed a method of diagnosing and assessing the human personality based on called a circumplex, and that who a person was depended on who they were with. And so I hear your spirited, LA, Barlow, misogyny, his relationship to Barlow, that's a whole nother complicated thing. And Tim is a guy that was, born in the 20s, was raised with all that 1950s stuff. He was a man, he spanned all these generations and all of these mentalities. And so while that's true, there are other aspects that are true as well.
Yeah, I get that. And we're obviously chipping away at a very complex character. And you knew him. I didn't know him. But in my research, it seemed like a lot of people thought that he was, I don't know, lobotomized, definitely hit with a lot of mind control while he was in prison. So I'm just curious, just for our conversation now, did you meet him after that had happened?
Yes.
You said it was after he got out of prison.
Yeah. And I saw him, let me just here's something, maybe this can answer part of the question. I was with him about 3 weeks before he died. And we Paul Lee and Frank Barron had an Irish wake at his house. And it was a Harvard reunion. And all of the guys that were principal at the Harvard Project came to say goodbye to, they called him Coach. He had a little baseball hat. And I'm here still just trying to figure out, like, who is this guy? Did he wreck psychedelic research here? LSD and these drugs came into our society and they had such rich potential. And he was an egomaniacal, guy who, tried to attach his own fame to them. Did he really blow it? Was he a demonic character? Did he actually rescue the drugs from the CIA and turn them over to the people? Who was this guy? And I had this moment with him. It was really remarkable, where he's in his wheelchair and I'm just sitting in the corner and I'm looking at him. And he would, maybe you've noticed on psychedelics, when you look at a person, and a woman will be like incredibly beautiful, divinely beautiful, and then like morph into really ugly and hideous, and then morph again into this, and this like kaleidoscopic parade of kind of images. And that's what was happening to him. There would be a moment I would see him and he would just you could feel his aura, this glow of this like sparkly, lucid Zen master, maneuvering and just being so present. But then it would shift and you'd see this like twisted, pained, kind of narcissistic and, like disturbed character. And then he'd morph again into this, brilliant wise man. And so, that's what I have to say about that kind of all of these things are true. His life was like an acid trip.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like he was definitely playing the role of trickster, shapeshifter. One thing that I think is a through line is like this Hollywood CIA thing, and how they capitalize on these charismatic personalities, this desire. It wasn't a desire to like have a positive impact on humanity. It was a desire to be famous, to receive recognition. And I think, just Emily you were talking about this in your show about what's going on with gymnastics, and like people get famous really fast and all of a sudden they're ops. The thing that like struck me when the documentary came out about Leary and the way that he died was, how could someone who was such a learned scholar and had so much experience with psychedelics and the exploration of the outermost edges of consciousness think that consciousness resides in the physical human head and be attached to that? Like that never made any sense to me.
Yeah, well, it only makes sense to that part of Leary who was the materialistic scientist trying to speak to that those people. But because I would say that to him, like, Tim, what the fuck are you doing, man? And you know what he said to me? Something like, he said, well, he didn't actually do that, but his line to me was, look, I'm just trying to keep my options open, and who knows, when I die, I may change my mind and have him stick me in the blender, and he was like, he was funny like that. He didn't have fixed ideas, but almost everything that he said then got frozen in time and people use it. Well, here, this is what he was like here. And, at some point you and I maybe trade some stories about Bob Thurman's role in this. And I mean, there's so many parts to this.
Yeah.
And, that Paul David's documentary is, some of it is very good, but some of it's really kind of screwy and doesn't give a very good impression of who Tim. But
yeah, it seems like he's super, super complex character. And that's, I mean, kind of the issue with any fame, anything that's like pinned to some realm of forever, where it's like, this is an aspect in one singular moment. And it sounds like he shifts. I'm going to go with shifts, because what I want to touch on before going over to you, Emily, is this piece. So there was this thing about tune in, drop out, right? Fuck the government, as you said. And yet he was West Point. He ran for governor. He was Harvard. These are like as establishment could possibly get. And there's a quote in your book where he says, within one generation, these chemical keys to the nervous system will be used as regular tools of learning. You will be asking your children when they come home from school, not what book are you reading, but which molecules are you using to open up new libraries of Congress inside your nervous system. Libraries of Congress, not the Akashic records, not universal knowledge, but again, a systemic collection of knowledge. So what I got from this was, one, that he was pushing transhumanism really early, and was he sent from the future to seed this? And you had talked about his fascination with tech. And that's kind of my biggest thing is like, I didn't really see him dropping out or living an example of dropping out. And then what's up with the time travel piece?
Okay, I'm gonna hop in here because somebody said time travel. Okay, so I'm actually going to reserve most of my time travel comments for towards more the end of the conversation because I'm going to attach them to something that I don't think you guys are going to see coming.
Okay, wait, Emily, I'm sorry, but I want to interrupt you and just touch on one thing that Danny said and then return to this about turn on, tune in, drop out, because that's such an important meme in Tim's life. Now, we've talked about Operation Mockingbird, I believe, on this program, right? Operation Mockingbird was one of the first major operations of the CIA, which was their main social engineering scheme, infiltration of media and education and publishing and film to socially construct, using psychological research, the kind of worldview and personality that they wanted. Tim was recruited into Operation Mockingbird in 1947. He knew that there was this social engineering scheme underway. And so when he said turn on, tune in, drop out, he really, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's really talking about drop out of that contrived, socially engineered reality and look within and create your own worldview. Create your own. This is a major part of his cultural therapy, to shift the locus of authority from these institutions, these social engineering schemes, from education, to look within and to create your own reality. Be responsible for your own nervous system and the world that you create. Create your own religion, drop at it. And so you're right, Danny, he does have all these, major establishment credentials, but you have to look like when he was at Harvard, his last lecture as a Harvard faculty was fuck the university. He got in there, he could see, he really knew what he was talking about when he denounced the corruption of these institutions and agencies. So I just wanted to reflect.
I hear what you're saying, and it is such a valuable message that has guided me. Like, he was absolutely an influence on me, but at the same time, he was on the payroll of the very institutions that he's telling people to get away from. So it's just very hard to resolve.
He's a very challenging figure. He wasn't actually on the payroll. There's one of the things that he said about, he wasn't really paid by the CIA. The CIA funded his research at Harvard for a while, but he was never like an actual, this gets into another conversation when you're working for the CIA. He wasn't like on the CIA. He was picked by the CIA. He was used by the CIA. And as soon as he found out that he was being used by the CIA, he rebelled against them.
But what about snitching for the FBI?
That's another thing. That's another example of how his character has been assassinated in a whole episode that has been wildly overblown to make him look like a snitch. And that gets into some details about the prison escape, which was, in my estimation, my research, that was a CIA operation itself. He was sprung from prison by the Weather Underground. And you just got to look at this stuff. Like the Weather Underground were CIA kids, right? And so when he's like so-called snitching, he's like the two people who Rosemary, his wife, had to live underground for 25 years because of that. She forgave him. And Michael Horowitz, his archivist, spent a month in jail.
What about
What about who?
Hoffman?
Abby Hoffman?
Mm-hmm. I thought he snitched on Hoffman.
No, he didn't snitch on Hoffman. Tim was really threatened. He was in a dire place, and he was playing the whole time. And then suddenly he realized this is not a game. These guys are fucking serious. I'm in prison now. I'm not just in prison. I'm in Folsom. I'm being labeled a snitch. They threatened the life out of him. And he was finally saying, look, I've had enough of this. Let's just all put our cards in and start another game. Mm-hmm. And so he said, he did say a few things, and it got that whole snitching thing was really the establishment's attempt to completely discredit him. He was sentenced to, 30 something years in prison for a little bit of weed. And they came down on him really hard. And I kind of forgive him for that. Now, Joanna is another story. I caught some flack, mostly from her about that, but I had those comments vetted by people. She was not a significant person in his life. She may or may not have led him to his final arrest there in Afghanistan. And that's still an open question and deserves careful scrutiny, but we're not going to cover everything here, but this is a long conversation. I'm glad you're so on it to provoke this dialogue.
Okay. So I am going to make there's two. So I'm not, Timothy Leary is one of the people that I have the least amount of actual knowledge from research about, as far as people that I followed who are into psychedelics. But I think I intuitively understand some things about him. And most of what I know about him, I learned from Robert Anton Wilson in his book, The Cosmic Trigger. And I like Robert Anton Wilson. I see him as like similar to me in that he's not super pro or anti any particular idea or character. He's kind of like more trying to understand exactly what's going on and enjoying the amusement of it all. Right. And so I like his perspective. It doesn't feel like he's pushing an idea that he wants me to agree with. Right. So I'm going to start with two things that he says in his book. So he says, and I completely agree, like with this, that he says in Dr. Timothy Leary's terminology, each trip involved a transmutation of consciousness from the symbolic and linear terrestrial circuits of the nervous system to the somatic genetic future circuits, right? I think that's how he describes what is going on in the psychedelic process, right? And I think that is really, really accurate. And then there's also, I'm going to return to some more of this later, but I wanted to start with that. And then there's this other quote here from Robert Anton Wilson, where he said that he was talking about his idea of the net. And he said, the next link in the net was a meeting with Dr. Timothy Leary, the man who either brainwashed a whole generation with mind warping drugs, the opinion of his enemies, or discovered how to free the mind of humanity from culturally conditioned limitations, the opinion of his friends, right? So we have like a very either or kind of scenario being set up there. And I'm here to propose a both and, right? And maybe a little later, we'll actually get to what I think the and is, but you alluded to it a little bit when you said that Timothy Leary was playing games. And so we'll get to that part a little bit later, but I wanted to respond to some things. I wanted to kind of put out an idea. Two things, first of all, right? I'm going to use some tennis analogies because I think I work best when I use tennis analogies.
Well, he loved sports analogy. He was a,
Right.
he was a good old American jock.
Okay. So I'm going to,
in fact, sorry, there's a chapter in this book with Paul Krasner that's called A Game of Mind Tennis with Timothy Leary. So
perfect. All right. So he's going to appreciate this. So it's been my assessment that, like, from sort of feeling the energy around this and listening to you talk about him both today, but also in the other conversations as we lead up, that like Timothy Leary is like for you what Rafael Nadal is for me, right? I'm not saying they're similar personalities. They're absolutely not similar personalities, but Rafael Nadal is my favorite tennis player. And so I cannot assess his position in reality from a neutral standpoint, because I always want Rafael Nadal to win, right? Like, and he has some of the same unfortunate connections that some of his competitors do, that I can see those clearly because I'm not rooting for them, right? But when it's him, sometimes, I mean, I've gotten better at this over time, and likely once he retires from tennis, I won't have any more of these connections in sports, and I'll just be able to use them purely as analytical, exercises and whatnot. But I have a harder time, like rationalizing, right? Like there's some of these connections that Rafael Nadal has too. And there's a part inside of me that wants to overlook the elephant in the room on some of them because I so like the way he plays. And there's just, he's kind of my spirit animal when it comes to the way sports should be conducted and played and whatnot. So I wanted to present that as the first one. But then what I really wanted to do was move into this comparison of Timothy Leary to Novak Djokovic, if you like sports, and to Jim Carrey, if you like Hollywood or acting or comedy or whatever. They are massively carrying with them the trickster energy and this idea that they are rebelling against the general establishment of the culture in which they find themselves. Novak Djokovic, the traditional tennis culture, and Jim Carrey, the Hollywood culture. And that they are doing that, but there are these underlying other qualities to their personality that bring chaos in a way that sometimes actually ends up marching the people to the gulag faster than if they had just gone the traditional route on a certain level. And so with Djokovic and Carey, you both have people who are presenting themselves as being like anti-vaccine, pro-health freedom, things like that. But some of their other sort of ideas and connections and beliefs are not well explained. And also the behavior and the way in which they go about rebelling against said system isn't smart. It brings a lot of opportunity for like criticism in a way that actually hurts what they say they're trying to help. Right. And so I'm just like drawing that, like I get the same like energy signature off of Timothy Leary that I get off of those two.
Yeah, let me just stop you for a second because I think that I feel that exact same way. In fact, the first draft of the screenplay that I've written, I modeled it after some of Milos Forman's films because that's a characteristic storyline, the anti-authoritarian character whose anti-authoritarianism becomes so it works against them. So you see that in Cuckoo's Nest, you see that in The People versus Larry Flint. And I had Milos Forman interested in my project and the way I outlined Leary exactly along those lines. In fact, it was about 20 years ago, and was hoping to get Jim Carrey's interest in it. So I think that's right on. That's
okay. So those are like, that's the energy signature for me. And I think all of these characters are interesting. And also we would be right to be suspicious of them on many levels, but I think nobody is actually asking the right set of questions about them. We'll get to that a little bit later, but I wanted to address a couple of other things. And you talk about this idea that he was democratizing like the use of psychedelics. Right. And on one level, that sounds great. But on another level, we also at this point, I think, are beginning to see clearly how democracy is yet another trick of the establishment. Right. It's basically this idea that like the people have a choice, but the choices are like the options for their choices are like pre-selected by the monarchy that they supposedly had been deposed when you bring in the idea of democracy. And so this idea that what more people want, like the choice that more people make is the choice that everyone has to live with, right? And I think that is just like they have done this like real big mind control wash on Americans to convince them that they live in a democracy rather than a republic, which in a republic there's like a much more respect for individual rights than there is in a democracy. In democracy it's like mob rule basically, right? And for me, my opinion about psychedelics is that not that they can't have therapeutic use or research use or whatever, but the way that they should be used is up to the individual user. It shouldn't be up to any sort of like governing body or research body or healing center or whatever, right? So this idea of like democracy is like let the people decide what they're going to do with them. Like that wouldn't really be like democracy is letting, still in my opinion, other people like have say over the way you should, right? So like I don't know that democratization of the use of psychedelics would be the same thing as like an individual's liberty to use what nature provided in the way they want. And then the other thing I do want to note that like the thing that I know he was involved with and did other kinds of psychedelics, but the one he is most linked to is LSD, right? Which is a synthetic lab created psychedelic, which is a little bit different than the ones that are naturally provided by the earth. And I think that plays into what I think he actually is and what he's actually doing here. It is a much more engineered kind of thing than like the mushrooms or whatnot. That doesn't mean it's any less valid. It's just a different thing. And I also wanted to point out that you said something about your book is called Outside Looking In, and I think that's like pretty appropriate for where I'm going to go with this. I think at the end of the conversation, but I want to address what you said about the fact that Tim didn't like conspiracy, right? And so there's two ways to perceive that, right? So like there's the way like what I would imagine like Danny's thinking, well, of course he didn't like it because he's implicated in it, right? Like understanding the conspiracy around these things reveals him and whatnot. So there is that, and that is absolutely valid and true, right? But there's also, I could see another perspective, and I don't know if this is where you're coming from with it, Robert, but it's where I'm going to go with it later. And it's that he understood what conspiracy was used for in this sort of, I don't know if I want to say this realm, but yes, in this realm and at this time period, because even though it was a long time ago, he was doing what he was doing in the overall arch of time, it isn't that much time. It's not that long ago. So during this phase of history in this realm, conspiracy was being used as a tool to accomplish a particular task, right? And so I could understand why, as in his position, he didn't like conspiracy. That is a different reason than just why Danny would think. So those are my kind of takeaways from the first portion back and forth. So I think we should go back to Robert now and do another round.
Oh, hold on a sec, though. I just want to speak to one thing, a couple things you said, because I think the democratization piece is so important. And I'm so glad that you picked up on that and named it, because it applies to where we're at now, but that's not necessarily a good thing. And also, when you mentioned that LSD is lab created, we know it was Sandoz created, is where did Tim get all this money to be living in soulless Beverly Hills in the first place? Because no one's going to profit off of psilocybin, the way they're going to profit off of a completely pharmaceutically generated psychedelic.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, the financial profit aspect of this wouldn't be the first place I would go with his connection to it. I'd actually go somewhere else with it. But what I have noticed is in this, the way this reality works, that when there are certain processes, there's always coin earned, right there. And so I don't know that that was his desire or intent. I think the reason he chose to live, so your point about Beverly Hills and like how it's the most vapid soulless place in all of Los Angeles, I've never liked it. Of all my high dreams of fantasy of this, that, and the other thing I would do if I had money, Beverly Hills was never it. To me, it always felt like a stage set where they hide people who don't want to be bothered by the others who recognize that they're not real, right? Kind of thing. Like if you drive through Beverly Hills, it's like, what? Like it feels like you're on, like, when they do like the mock-up where they build a little diorama of what the town is going to look like in the movie or whatever. It feels like you somehow have entered into that. There's nothing real feeling about Beverly Hills. And it's definitely my least favorite place in all of Los Angeles. I would choose hanging out in East LA any day over hanging out in Beverly Hills.
Totally. It's also the least convenient place to live in LA.
But I don't think he was there. I don't think he was living in Beverly Hills because he wanted so much money. I think the money that came along with what he was doing provided him the ability to hide in Beverly Hills in a place where he would be safe from the plebes throwing stones at him, largely.
I don't see anyone with a soul or any sort of like feeling body or consciousness would willingly place themselves in Beverly Hills. It does not make any sense to me.
If they're hiding from something, maybe, or if they're trying to find like a safe spot, like a safe zone, right? Like a kind of thing, that would be the only reason that would make sense to me. maybe I have a judgment as to whether he's soulless or not, but it would be for a different reason than others might think. But the only you could hide in Beverly Hills with or without a soul, and it would be protecting you from something. Okay, back to Robert.
Wow. Okay, so this is really just completely fascinating to me, and it's really like take a deep breath and go through things bit by bit. I mean, Timothy Leary is it's a course. It's not going to be a podcast, but we're just going to hit some of these notes again. First of all, Beverly Hills. He lived in a little ranch house. He didn't have any money at all. It wasn't his house. When he died, he left like a he was indebted to the IRS like $250,000. He was a pauper. He would get I'd be with him. He'd make $1,000 in a lecture fee, and have to pay that out right away. To pay the food bill or try to pay the rent. It was a communal hippie house that he lived in with a bunch of people in their 20s. It wasn't like he had any money at all. He never did. In fact, I think it's a really fascinating, it's actually the opening to my movie to look at how Tim got this way, his relationship to money. But I'll tell that story another time. Just to put that out there. Yeah, Beverly Hills, we think of the wealth and the affluence and the soullessness, but I see Tim as this teenage prankster who's putting himself right in the middle of the, kind of spotlight, the media spotlight of the world, just to, cause pranks to get his message out. I mean, he loved it. He had a lot of celebrity friends, you'd be over there and they'd be, especially as he's dying, whether it's, Ringo Starr or Susan Sarandon or, all these people. I got to know Jack Nicholson by dropping Tim Leary's name. I mean, he loved the celebrity thing. This was a kind of just a feature of his psyche as a young boy when he realized this is I want to be recognized. And the reason he wanted to be recognized is because of these, very traumatic events that happened in his young childhood. His grandfather was reputed to be the wealthiest guy in Massachusetts. This very dignified guy who had this fortune and this big house. And it was his grandfather, Tim said, the only sane influence on his life. His father, on the other hand, was an alcoholic. He was a dentist, but he didn't really practice dentistry because he was an alcoholic. And he just ran up debt because he was waiting for his father to die when he would inherit this fortune. And so his grandfather, a couple of days before he dies, calls young Timothy into the room, and he gives him these words. He says, look, never take anything too seriously. The purpose of life is to have a good time. Don't let him get to you. This kind of thing. And then shortly after that, he dies. And everybody is expecting that Tim's father is now going to be wealthy. And it turns out, however, that his grandfather was just like a rascal, and he didn't have any money at all. The depression had depleted the fortune, and he had nothing. And so on this day, can you imagine this? Your father thinks he's going to become the richest guy in town, and he doesn't have any money at all. And he gives Tim a $100 bill, and he never sees him again. He's abandoned by his grandfather dies, and his father leaves him. And he's left to be raised with these really uptight, overly Catholic mother and aunt, and who try to turn Tim into a priest. And so, I mean, it's just sort of a whole comedic beginning and the beginning of a mindset that just has a really kind of twisted relationship to wealth. It's false. Authority, it's bullshit. And his aunt and his mother trying to squelch his, sexual curiosity, this kid. And so, you just kind of look at it from that point of view, and you begin to see that his playing out of the rest of his life and how it was set up by these early events. So that's one thing. You know, and the issue of democratization, you know, we could spend some time on this, and I think we should, because, you know, what's happening in the late 1950s and early 1960s is that Mkultra is trying to somatize, introduce soma. Huxley is one of the brains behind this operation. We know Brave New World, a totalitarian society that pretends to be something else. The people are anesthetized or distracted from their fate by this drug, soma. That's a psychedelic drug. People are told to take it, and so they just don't have it undermines their political consciousness, their ability to organize, makes them feel like everything is really okay. You know, Huxley predicted this whole wave of antidepressants and was a major force in popularizing LSD. So Tim is part of this. Tim is chosen. He's a charismatic, brilliant Harvard faculty, and he's recruited without his knowledge to be one of these figures that's going to help psilocybin and LSD become used by contemporary psychiatry, by the established institutions as a new form of soma. These drugs were controlled by the medical profession, by the FDA. The DEA hadn't even really been formed yet. And Tim was there to validate the institutions. He was part of it. When he was appointed to Harvard, he was like, wow, I'm at Harvard now, holy shit. And then he learned that he was being used. And so when I talk about democratizing the drugs, I'm talking about Tim. You know, before Tim, if you got LSD, it was given to you by somebody else who was watching you. Tim wanted to shift that. He didn't just popularize LSD, he popularized it with memes, to question authority and to think for yourself. The other set and setting that was preeminent at the time was not question authority, but kiss ass to authority, because look, authority is giving you this magic drug that's going to let you think you're seeing God. It's going to, it's to validate, whoever gives you LSD has just attained a great power over you. If the Catholic Church had LSD in their Eucharist, there would be a lot more members, right? So Tim wanted to change that. And again, as I said, shift the locus of authority. All the other psychedelic activism at that time was in service to the establishment, okay? Psychiatrists and universities. And then on the other end, there's Ken Kesey. Now, Ken Kesey is also a CIA asset or agent or operative. And his use of LSD was completely chaotic and random. Put it in the punch. There was no method to what Kesey was doing. It was just freak out and get fucked up and freak out. And that this was the cool thing to do. Ride around the country in a bus and just like get people tripping. There was a real method to what Tim was doing. That's the really important contribution, is that this is your nervous system and you don't just take it. You read his early stuff and he's methodical about using this drug within certain, spiritual context, with a model of, we went around to different things, and Tibetan Buddhist, and, you also got to remember, he's a guy in his late 30s and early 40s. I mean, I look at people like that, they're kids. They don't know what the fuck is going on. They're kids. He's a brilliant kid who is searching intelligently for a method to use these drugs against the agency that is trying to indoctrinate us into a totalitarian system. Okay, I mean, he is a firm believer in the humanistic, in democracy in the best sense, anti-establishment, pro individualism. And so I wanted to put that in. And I also wanted to respond to what you said about.
I just want to ask a question real quick, because, and I might be mistaken, you would know better, but wasn't Leary giving LSD to prisoners and students who didn't know they were being dosed?
No, thank you for saying that, because other psychiatric clinical research was doing that. And he thought that was completely unethical. And he said, no way, we're not doing that. Okay. So he violated the double-blind methodology. He's both criticized and praised for this. That's very important. And I also want to say something about LSD. I think, Danny, you said that he's most identified with LSD. And that's true, but again, that's part of the creation of his character that we have in the mainstream now. Because if you look carefully at Tim's writings about LSD, first of all, he never gave LSD, never did LSD research at Harvard. Now, all that research at Harvard was with psilocybin, and it wasn't actually psilocybin mushrooms. It was a synthesized psilocybin from Sandoz. When Tim got his first, this is really important to study. It's in his book, High Priest, my signed copy burned in the fire. But when Tim talks about his first LSD experience, it's also vague. There are a couple of different stories, but the official story that he tells it was given to him by this curious fellow named Michael Hollingshead, who was probably British intelligence. And he came up to Harvard and he gave it to Tim, and Tim tripped his brains out, quite literally. In fact, he said, I never was the same after my first LSD experience. And when you look at his chapter in his book, High Priest, he says, don't take this stuff. He said, I've never been able to take anything seriously again. He's basically saying it triggered a long-term psychosis. His first thing to LSD was, let's stay away from this stuff. This was the story in the Harvard thing, like, oh my God, we're not going to use that artificially created thing. Psilocybin was at least, synthesized from a natural product. And so is LSD, but still psilocybin had more of a kind of organic sense to it. LSD was totally contrived. And he said, we got to stay away from this stuff. And then when he got more famous, he even said this again and again. There were several instances throughout Tim's career where he said, I don't know about this LSD stuff. We should wait until we find out more about it. He was alarmed about it. He didn't really like it at first. But again, this is sort of an ego thing with him. He didn't really like to admit errors, and so he it kind of once he did something, and it's a complex process of rationalization and so on. And he was a poly drug user. He was an alcoholic and a nicotine addict his whole life, and he would take anything and everything. And that was, again, I said, he's a kind of flawed hero, and that was just that was a part of him. And so we have to be careful when we make these general statements that, he's identified with LSD. Yeah, but you look at his record, his history of spoken written word about LSD, it's by no means consistent.
So I agree. So I agree with almost everything you just said there, right? Like I was looking for it while you were talking, but there's like, when you were talking about how important process and procedure was to him with this, there is a segment of this book I recall from when I read it that talks about that. I'm having trouble finding it now, but I do first want to say that based on the way this conversation is going, I think that this is going to have to be part one of a part two on Timothy Leary, because I want to be able to look up this process and get into some of this with you since you brought it up, right? I want to be able to find it in here, because this was what I found to be so fascinating, was that, like, from that perspective, I agreed with just about everything Timothy Leary was saying. Where I want to push back on you a little bit here is that the idea of democracy has anything to do with individual liberty. Like you said, the best possible version of democracy. And I think that we have to let go of this idea that there's a best possible version of democracy, because democracy, in my opinion, but right, it's been weaponized. Like if there was, I don't know that there ever was. It's not just something that was a good idea that was weaponized, but the idea of democracy is like, you know, this is kind of synonymous to mob rule, right? And so that has nothing to do with individualism. So I think we need to be like, come really clear on what the actual term means, both like from where it comes from, but also in every way that it's been deployed. And I think maybe that we have to recognize that this is the biggest tool of mind control in the political space right now.
And I agree with you. And I think that's a fascinating and important aspect of political science to talk about. But where I'm using it here in terms of Tim and psychedelic drugs, I mean it as opposed to totalitarianism. Like if you look at a political spectrum, where is authority? In a fascist totalitarian system, the authority resides in the state, in the Führer, in the ruler, in the institutions, something outside of you, that the people are weakened and they project their power onto this. In this idealistic form of democracy, and I have no argument with you that it's used as a tool by these tyrants, but in the way that I'm using it here, it's the opposite. It's where the authority resides in each and every person.
So
and that's a big difference.
I know that's what you mean, but I think this is, and you know, this is maybe where Danny comes in. This is how we have to reprogram ourselves with language here and find a better term to use. And the term that I would go with would be more the voluntarist approach, like the voluntarist use, or maybe the like the natural, like a natural rights approach to like, I'm here and I'm a natural being and these things exist and I have the right to do with them what I want, as opposed to applying the term of democracy to it. But I don't want to get too,
I agree.
I don't want to get too far into about that. So first I want to propose that we have, we turn this into a two-parter so we can get into some of this process and procedure, because I think it's fascinating and I think it goes to what my hypothesis about Tim is going to be. But I did want to read, if this is okay with you, I didn't plan to do this. I was just going to bring up some of these topics, but there's a little segment here from this book that I think is really interesting. And this is the right place to bring it in. And so it says here, Tim seemed on first meeting a typical middle-aged academic type, although more athletic than most. We mention this because he looked much younger in later years. When we discuss metaprogramming theory later and Paul Segal's investigations into amino acids related to psychedelics and aging, we will find some evidence that Dr. Leary's youthful image may have a biochemical explanation. Besides being an athletic young middle-aged man, Tim was singularly free of the space-time compulsions of normal Americans. He sometimes stands as close as a Mexican when he talks to you, and he is apt to look straight at you without the usual American eye shifting. If this makes you nervous, he backs off and allows you to relax. But basically, he is most comfortable himself within the intimate relationship. And of course, the famous Leary grin was already part of him. The best results come when you fuck someone you really love during the acid trip, he said that day. That's when the nervous system is most open, most unconditioned, and ready to take a completely new imprint. Tim was delighted that the reporters, so Robert Anton Wilson refers to himself as a variety of characters. And so he's talking from his reporter self. Tim was delighted that the reporter understood enough psychology to translate terms like zero-sum game, reinforcement, transaction, etc. And he was especially pleased that unlike any other interviewer he had ever met, this reporter was familiar with the book of Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality and wanted to question him about how the space-time transformations of the psychedelic voyage correlate with his space-time definitions of personality types in that work. LSD takes you out of the normal space-time ego, he said concisely. I always go through a process in which the space game comes to an end and the time game comes to an end, and then the Timothy Leary game comes to an end. This is the peak, and at this point, a new neurological imprint can be made because all the old imprints are suspended for a while then. So, like, I think all of these things that we're talking about here, like, depend upon the angle that you're viewing Timothy Leary from. And you brought up the idea that he was a time traveler, right? That he was here coming from the future. And I think that's right, partially right? But I think the bigger thing that I would like to get into, like talk a little bit about it right now, but maybe really deeply in and talk about some of these processes later, was that he was very, very, very well aware that he was playing a game, that he was, right, in a reality altering character in some sort of alternative reality or augmented reality type of game. He was a big fan of game theory, right? And game theory was something that was really presented during about the same time, a little bit later than we really first started hearing of Timothy Leary, by like the Rand Corporation, right? And so I think what we are seeing right now in terms of what's going on in our culture with the biochemical reprogramming of humanity through vaccinations, through pharmaceuticals, and the way that these biochemical, neurological processes are mirroring things in our technology and our financial systems are part of us beginning to understand the game board that we are playing on, to which I believe Timothy Leary sort of landed on from the future to create certain scenarios to propel the game forward. Okay. And so when you were even talking about like the family that he found himself in, right? And it almost feels like, okay, Timothy Leary, we're gonna drop you in Boston. Like this is you're entering the alternative reality game, right? And the deal is this: you're going to be dropped in Massachusetts in 19 whatever with $100 in your pocket, and you have to find your way to this place, right? You're here to introduce these ideas, these topics, and to get people to engage in this so the game can ensue, right? And when we start to look at it in retrospect, from the point we find ourselves now in history back towards what he was doing, I think we will find a cohesive thread. So whether like to be like, oh, like Timothy Leary was like, you know, the savior of psychedelics, or oh, Timothy Leary was actually like the worst person in the world for psychedelics, completely misses what he was here to actually do. And that was to introduce it to really like I've talked about before, that when people start doing mushrooms, right, they join a network. Like once you've joined the network, you're part of the fabric, you're part of that system, and you kind of like can observe and be observed by anything in that system. And that one is a natural one, to the extent that nature is what we think it is. And this synthetic one that's been created by LSD is also a system, but it's one that has a different set of controls based on the fact that it is synthesized. It completely comes from a laboratory. It's pretty much completely created, right? So even the way he talks about some of his processes feels like, you know, creating characters, nodes, levels in a game that need to be advanced upon in order to get to the place where we used to talk when we played video games when we were kids about like beating the game. How many levels could you go through? Once you've been through a certain level, you know where all the pitfalls are from it, and you can play that level better next time and whatnot. And I think what he was doing in his approach to this matches up to that. So I think what he's really here is like as a character in a game, but he's bringing the idea of game theory, which is about creating a certain level of chaos, and then basically like becoming aware of one's position in an ARG. Do you know what an ARG is, Robert?
No.
So it's an alternative reality game. Some people also call them an augmented reality game, right? And then, there's this other idea that my friend Michael Wan is starting to bring forward. And I think this is where some of us come into this, is the idea of an altering reality game, right? And so I think Tim probably was aware of this kind of stuff long before these ideas were sort of inserted into our cultural cultural mind of how we think about these things. And he was experimenting with all aspects of this, with being with alternate realities, with augmented realities, and then with altering realities. And I think his behavior it displays that idea. So, thoughts?
I think I think he would love that. I think that just goes to show what I said at the beginning, that you get the Timothy Leary you deserve, and that he was so mercurial that whatever form you see him in is going to be a form largely of your own creation. And so, he really loved to be in the presence of very young people, not for any, creepy reasons, but just because he really wanted to be a change agent, an evolutionary agent. And he saw that's obviously, the future is enfolded in the youth. And that's where he wanted to focus. And then, I was thinking about his youthfulness and his athleticism. He wasn't actually that athletic. He loved sports metaphors. He loved to wear sneakers. He always wore sneakers. I've never seen him with anything else on his feet but sneakers. And that was something that was added to his attire when he first went to Harvard. And then also, I noticed this with people who have a particularly youthful quality about them, that it often is the case, people who are where is your trauma? Where are your deepest traumas? And people who are traumatized at very young ages are frozen there in that state. And so they exhibit very, very youthful qualities, tones of voice, and so on. And like I'm more, like I'm older than you guys, or so my metaphors and the lens that I see him through is somewhat different. I was trained more in kind of conventional psychoanalytic and Jungian psychological systems. And so I see, I kind of see him through this as the young boy, as I said, the incident with the father and the grandfather and the culture, and, working at what was going on in post-war America, and not in these kind of futuristic kind of categories that you're talking. So,
but the lovely thing about the sort of viewpoint that I'm introducing here is it requires that there be an interesting backstory for the creation of the character on the game board, right? And so all of that comes into place. And then also the other thing with like Jung stuff is like Jung really brings forward this idea of synchronicity that then becomes an intelligence tactic. So we have game theory as an intelligence tactic and synchronicity as an intelligence tactic. And they're kind of like theories that are coming from maybe different positions or different points or coordinates in time, but come together in certain scenarios and in certain characters and help to sort of define the way they're able to move about on the game board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It does make sense. And
when you were talking about the time travel, the youth, the amino acids, which really sticks out to me because of the coding in amino acids that they detail in Keys of Enoch, and then how Gene Keys also uses amino acids. I was just seeing, this is a really long game. This is a way longer game than I think, I'll just speak for myself because this is my perspective, that I could possibly conceive. And then Robert, when you said, and you repeated it, that Tim said, you get the Tim Leary that you deserve, that is an incredibly arrogant statement, right? Like that's what I'm getting from that, is this like, I'm so large, I'm so, this sort of like self-centered arrogance. And then what immediately popped to mind was how many times I've heard Joe Rogan say it would be impossible to control me. And just seeing like these very bombastic, larger than life characters being inserted into this very long, multi-dimensional game that we are trying to figure out.
So
fascinating. So let me just say something about that, because I don't think of it as arrogance. I think of it as just a kind of more sophisticated, epistemology. That's true about everything. Anything that you experience, you get here. You're going to get this cup that you created. And this cup is, to me, one thing is holding my lemon water. you know, I have a thing with it. You're going to see it in a different way. This is just how the world
There's
works.
no acknowledgement of a co-creative reality or of both
Well,
parties being equal players having something to learn. It's all about me, which is people who seek fame in, you know, who say from a little kid, I want to be famous, not I want to be great at X. I see a through line.
yeah, no, it's good. I know there was a lot of people thought of him as very arrogant. Again, I lived at his house, you know, a lot of the, you know, 3 days a week for the last several months of his life. And so I cleaned him up. He was getting very frail. I lit his cigarettes for him. I buttoned his shirts, you know, I saw this, you know, really vulnerable little boy. I wish you were my father, you know, he said to me once. I saw him when he went to Catholic Mass, you know, a few days before he died, just with this total uncertainty, like, you know, what the fuck have I gotten into, and what is salvation? And I mean, I saw the arrogant stuff. That's why when I introduced our thing, I've gone through all these phases, and I'm not attached to any one. I see this being that, you know, takes on the form of what model you're bringing to understand him. And I don't have an attachment to anyone. It's a fluid, you know, wild phenomena, like the psychedelic movement that he was you know, such a big part of. We're like, what the hell is this? And you know, I've always loved this phrase, you know, fixed ideas, to beware of those. There are no fixed ideas, right? It's a flow, it's a process. And he is a very challenging and delightful example of this.
So, couple of things. So I think maybe like a better way to have said it would have been, you get the Timothy Leary you can imagine instead of the one you deserve. Like,
okay.
Obviously some sort of shape-shifting trinket of sorts, right? Like that, like your imagination can sort of like interact with and turn into whatever, you know, kind of like how you view playing a game to a certain extent. He is a character, like he's a central character in a particular kind of game, and to the way that you sort of view that character, or sort of like position yourself on the game board in relation to it, it has to do with how you imagine it. But the other thing I've noticed about people like Tim Leary is they always come with a warning attached to them that's obvious. His name is Tim Leary. Right? You can take it as be leery of Tim. You can take it as, I see another way of perceiving Tim as time. Be leery of time. Is Tim really talking about time? Right? Like there's all these things wrapped up even in his name that, like, you know, the players have to identify themselves. It seems like it's sort of a truth of our reality, is that they are what they say they are, kind of thing. And so there's that with him. But to what you said about these processes with the biochemical things, so for both of you, like one of the things that it's weaved in through all of my recent work, but I'm really getting into it with Michael Wan and the Project Kid series, and now I'm playing the Glass Bead game. So if either of you guys would like to look at any of those, let me know, and I'll make sure that you guys can see those. And I've even gotten into it a little bit recently in some of the shows I've done recently with Nish, but we are in a time right now where we need to radically re-understand or radically reimagine the way we perceive some of these like coded things, like the way like we get like RNA, DNA, like the way that like biochemical, like the body's processes are named, the way the financial processes are named, a la cryptocurrencies and stock markets, they're coded in a similar manner. And all of these letters have multiple ways of being perceived. And there seems to be a correlation between the biochemical processes that are being programmed into our bodies right now and these processes that are affecting financial markets and social engineering and things like that. There seem to be a connection. And I think that the gene keys is a really nice synthesis of that. Like it really seems to get it. And what's funny is, like, I just had this realization the other day that all these things, I'm talking about all these things, and I'm also reading the gene keys, and he has such a different style than I do that I almost it evaded my awareness, even though I was in the midst of it completely. Like there's, you know, what he's doing is another way of saying a lot of the same stuff that I'm talking about. I'm just using more pop culture references and things people can easily place and understand than what he's sort of talking about. And then also I've revisited the book I was reading at the very beginning of the Project Kid stuff, which is Synchronicity by David Pete, David Pete, or F. Pete David, or something like that. And he was talking about sort of synchronicity and the immune system, and how there's a correlation between the immune system and the way that we perceive reality through time and synchronicity. So I think this is where we're at. And this was actually probably like what Leary was doing here, right? To a certain extent, like he was a very early player on the game board of trying to explore. So like, you said something earlier about you were surprised that he thought that consciousness was located inside the brain, right? It doesn't surprise me at all, because I think he was probably one of the first people either clued in by basically like having an imagination like mine, or possibly read in based on what he was representing as a player here. It could be either one. I'm not ready to make a decision on how he got here yet. But if he understood, as I did, that like space is just an outer projection of the workings, the inner workings of our mind, then to understand it, he was pulling it back into the body, right? And so when I've talked about how like the glia in our brain, like literally looks like the same thing as when you look out at the sky, the stars at night, right? It's kind of a way of pulling it in. If you are trying to be the masterful game player, that all of those things have to be within your sort of, you have to find something inside of you to ground it with, to understand the process on the outside. So I'm not saying he's right in his kind of analogy, but the idea that everything that we think of external actually exists right here within, like I could see that that would be one perception of it. It's not to say it's right or not, but it's a kind of another way of also saying that, like, oh yeah, a secret space program is a brain mapping program or a mind control program. I don't know if that's what he meant, but when you said that, I was like, okay, like I can see, like I can't imagine he really thought that, right? But maybe he did. I don't know enough about him, but it made me think of that, right? It made me think of grounding the bigger external process in the smaller biological cell, right? Self.
I could kind of wrap my mind around that, but even to the extent, and I also want to say to you, Robert, I would like for the record that I personally don't think having a diverse taste for intoxicants necessarily equates to being a flawed character. And I feel
anyway, go ahead. Thank you. Okay.
Just having, the extent of psychedelic experience that I believe Tim had, or it seems Tim had, even just that level of attachment to one's individual identity, individual consciousness, individual intellectual capacities just never made sense to me.
I get you. No, I just like, I'm not saying that it's right. I just think that like, okay, maybe that's what he was trying to do, is like ground this bigger thing into something smaller and whatnot. And as we go through maybe next time, some of these like processes he's laid out, like he really had mapped out the psychedelic experience to like, this is what happens at this level, and this is what happens at this level, and this is what happens at this level, as if he was trying to create a map of the process, right? And a mind that would do that is the same kind of mind that would maybe reduce things to what you're talking about, right? And not that it's a bad idea though. Like I think his map is largely accurate, but like it takes away some of the like magic of the of the experience to know that it's always going to go like this, like this, like this, right? So, anywho, was there anything else that either one of you wanted to kind of add to? We'll start winding it. We have about 10 minutes or so left for today. So I didn't know if there was kind of any place else that either one of you guys wanted to go with that. We good?
Well, Danny, do you want to go first?
No.
Closing statements time for today. We'll have another round in a few weeks.
Okay, well, again, I think it's fascinating how we approach this, from different places. I mean, I knew the guy, and I got to relate to him from all these different points of view. First, as a critical, brash kid myself, to, you know, someone that was helping him die. I actually administered his last psychedelic. I was a guide for him. I gave him DMT a couple of weeks before he died. And that was really something. You know, I helped clean him up when he was not capable. And I just feel a great love for him. It's mostly in my heart that I feel him. And then in my role as a scholar and as an historian, to see the role that he played in this historical phenomena that we really just have a kind of tiger by the tail here. You know, I just think of stories. I have a lot of feeling for him, more than I have intellectualization about him. And I'm thinking this is a kind of classic Leary thing. And I think it's just kind of funny because it shows a lot of the parts. So, you know, I mean, he was a you know, a very fervent critic of Catholicism and you know, monotheism and organized religion and sexual repression and all these things. And so about 4 days before he dies, he decides to go, he's persuaded to go to Catholic Mass by Bob Guccione Jr. Bob Guccione's father was, of course, the founder of Penthouse, but his son, Bob Guccione Jr., has become a kind of rabid Catholic. And Tim and he are friends, and so he convinces Tim to go to church. And I was there, and I was like, Tim, what are you doing, man? He got all dressed up in a tuxedo, and he said, he just kind of had this impish little look of like a, you know, a 12-year-old, something like, you know, he's going to get punished. And he goes, well, you know, you never know. So he goes to church, the limo comes and he goes to church, and comes back a few hours later, and he's completely disheveled. Every hair was in place when he left, but when he comes back, his tie is all off, his hair is a mess, he's got this wild look in his eyes, he's smoking his Benson and Hedges. They wheel him into the house, and he and I are the only ones up or in the house. And he comes over and I say, so Tim, you know, how was it? And he says, he lights a cigarette and he says, those damn Catholics, you know, they're always telling you what to do. You got to sit down, you got to kneel, you got to stand up, and just that whole, like that was the real him. But it became very profound a bit later in the evening. He knew he was near his end, and he was kind of frightened about it. And he was afraid he was in a wheelchair. He could barely stand up, but he didn't want to be sitting in the wheelchair because he was afraid he might fall asleep. And if he fell asleep, he was afraid he might not wake up. And so he was trying to balance himself on the table with his arms like this. And he was just like trying to stay awake. And I was saying, you know, come on, Tim, why don't you go to bed? It's late. And he got kind of cross with me, like, you know, can't you see I'm doing an experiment here? I'm trying to see if I can sleep standing up. And then he went into this kind of trance where he was talking to some voices, it seemed like. And he was saying, I did a good job. I did a good job. And just, I don't know if I'm conveying it here, but just like that moment was really just special to me. And I think he did do a good job. He was in way over his head on a very sophisticated, massive mind control operation that he wanted to muck up. That I believe that deep in his soul, which was huge, in spite of where he lived, you know, he had like his sense of goodness and natural humanity and love and honesty, even though there's many instances of fraudulence in his life and plagiarism and, you know, just stuff that he went through when he was growing up. You know, he was a flawed character. There was just a human being there at the end that I could see and just loved. So
I wanted to go back to something you had said on the last little round about how he liked to be with young people. He liked youthful energy, right? And I think that there's a couple of things that might explain that. I do believe he was from the future. And so the idea of being around young people who could conceive of the things that might exist in the future, as opposed to maybe people whose own age or people who are a little bit older, who are a little bit more like, now this is reality, this is how it is, that there was that. But the other thing that travelers always need is fuel, right? And a lot of travelers can create their own, but being around young people is like a type of energy. And the other thing is, for a character like him, who I think is both a traveler, but also saw himself as like some kind of avatar or godlike character to a certain extent, right? They require a lot of attention. And if they don't have attention, they begin to wither away and die, right? And I think that that was part of why he end kind of in the way he did. And even that, what you're describing to me right now about like how he was trying to hold himself up so he wouldn't fall asleep, it made me think of like things that I've seen and probably things I've done myself, like when I've been around like tweakers, people doing drugs and they're trying to stay awake, right? They've been up for fucking days and for some reason they don't want to go to sleep because it's like a sign of some sort of weakness, or they might not wake up in the same way that they thought of themselves when they crashed out or whatever, right? And so I would see people do all this crazy shit to take, to try and stay awake, right? Or just try and stay relevant in whatever game that they thought they were sort of playing. So that was kind of what that image sort of evoked for me.
Yeah, that just goes to, I mean, that's again what I'm saying, is that we see the world through our lenses, through our models. I mean, like when you say he was a person from the future, do you think that about other people too? Or is that a model? Like, he doesn't seem like a person to the future to me. He seems like a guy that came from Springfield. And
so
he evolved this way. But
there's some people that I see as being from the future. There's some people I see as like being from the ancient past, and there's other people I see of being more of just like originating from more of a current time. And he does seem to me like he was here from the future, or here from outside of what we completely understand as our space-time sort of realm. And I think the things that he engaged in and was good at are evidence of that. And I think that, like, I don't think he was trying to muck up the mind control program for the benefit of humanity. And I also don't think he was trying to muck up the mind control, to push the mind control program to hurt humanity. I think he was here doing what he thought he was, he had a certain thing he was doing. Like, he was playing a particular game, he was playing his role in something, and everything else was an extension of that, right? And if he were truly trying to help the people, he would have blown the whistle in a different kind of way, right? And if he were truly trying to hurt the people, then he probably wouldn't have ended up being really like poo-pooed on by this sort of controlled science psychedelic kind of system that we see coming into place right now. He was here doing what he was doing, and we're not clear on what that is yet. And so I guess for me, I'm just taking the position of like, I'm going to remain neutral on his intent until I figure out what it is he was doing. But I don't think either way he was here with the intention of hurting or harming. He was here with, he came in with an objective. And I don't know if that was that to move people towards a particular kind of future. He may have thought that was a wonderful future. So in his mind, that would have been doing good, right? I don't know. But I don't think that he was doing the same thing that most of the other characters of the psychedelic movement were doing. He was playing a different game, or he was aware of something else afoot that not all of them were aware of. Like, if we say that like some of these characters in the psychedelic movement who have like the more Nazi connections, like Albert Hoffman, right? That if they were here somehow representing or very invested in controlling time, right? Like and seeing things from like a time perspective, Tim was definitely here from a game perspective, right?
If I was going to, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to, I gave a talk the other day on what I called, people talk about, the psychedelic movement And I think that's a real error. There's one family of drugs, but there are many different movements. You know, there are several different, and I talked about them, but you could also just say there's two categories. There's those who use drugs to control consciousness, to manipulate it, and there are those who use the drugs to free consciousness. And Tim was definitely in that camp. That he became, again, and there was a real turning point in 1963, and we didn't even get to this because it's really one of the most important moments in psychedelic history, with the whole story with Mary Pinchot Meyer and the psychedelic initiation of President John Kennedy that Tim had a role in, that probably led to Kennedy's assassination. It was a real important junction in human history, and Tim was definitely for freedom. He wasn't for, power or domination or control. That he was, kind of a bodhisattva in that way. And he was a playful, prankish sort of character. And, he cut corners and he made his own rules, and he was, delightful in that way. But, a big complicated subject.
All right, so
did you ever meet him at all? Did you ever see him live or?
Nope, I've never met any of these. I've never met any. You're the only psychedelic character in history that I've ever spoken.
And have you read? Like, I'm curious what you've read, because he's left quite a legacy of written material.
I've not read anything he's written. Literally. My only awareness of Timothy Leary is what other people say about him. My own intuitive feeling for who he actually is, like the energy signature I get, and then what Robert Anton Wilson had to say about him.
Well, Bob was a complicated character himself. I got to hang out quite a bit with Bob. He died just down the street from here, and he used to have kind of were they weekly meetings or were they monthly meetings? I don't know, but I would go and we'd hang out. We became friends. He's another character. But I would encourage you to read Tim, and especially read, if you had to pick one book about him, it would be his flashbacks. I really think that's one of the most important and interesting.
All right, I'll check out his flash, because So I would say, and this is gonna be my last thing, and then we'll let Danny kind of close here. But I would say that rather than framing it as he was for freedom, from my perception so far, and I'll check out his flashbacks because I do think that I have some understanding of the way he visualized and saw things and whatnot. I would say he was here to initiate a process, right? And I don't know that freedom would be the name of that process, right? I would think he was literally here to unleash a biochemical process, to send something developing in a certain direction. And I'm sure there is people that co-opted that, and I'm sure that there are people that did good things with that or whatever. But I think to make the broad sweep that it was for freedom or not for freedom is like that, makes it us less able of understanding what it was. So that's kind of the position I'm going with it on it. Danny, did you want to say anything before we wrap it up? Because I'm gonna have to jump on.
I do. I want to first of all acknowledge, like, it's so clear, Robert, how much love you have for Tim and how close you were. And I just, want to speak to that's so beautiful. And you're obviously coming from a more relational, emotional understanding than Emily or I have. And I'm also looking forward, if we are indeed going to do a part 2, to learning more about what he did to muck up MK and these other control mechanisms. I think filling that in is going to be really helpful. And I also think that I am leaning more towards Emily, and Emily and I, are tracking this, a much larger conversation that's just not limited to the psychedelic sphere. But whereas Tim might have thought he was working to liberate humanity and maybe even did on a lot of levels, there's the larger question of who was using Tim, and why was Tim dropped into culture at the time that he was, and what is unfolding from that. And it might not be, like Emily was saying, it's not an either or, maybe it's an and. This
both and, yeah.
Enormous, multidimensional, paradoxical and.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it'll be fun to play around more with these ideas. I forgot to mention Rosemary, another great. Rosemary was his most beloved wife at the key part of his psychedelic ministry, and she and I were very dear friends. And she had some great one-liners about Tim as he went through the different stages. And one of the things she said near the end of his life was, he's finally reached a point where his heart is as big as his ego. I like that one. And he was also pronounced as being an inefficient wizard. I like that one too. But maybe the best one came from Tim when near the end of his life, he had Bo was always by his side, his golden retriever. And Bo was really needed to be put down. Bo was blind and in a lot of arthritic pain, but Tim couldn't bear that. And Tim liked to call himself at the end of his life, he said, "I'm just a seeing eye human for a blind dog."
All right.
I thought that was really nice.
Let's leave it there. You guys can find Robert on Facebook at Robert Forte.
Yeah, so far that's it. I'm pretty invisible except for that.
Okay, and you guys know where to find Danny and I. So Danny and I will be back in 2 weeks with our own regular word show, and we'll be back with Robert next month for part 2 on Timothy Leary. And we're gonna hop off now. Both of you guys stick here for 1 second. See you guys later. Cool.
Bye.
Okay.